to talk about this question of what is a strategy and why should we care? The University of Wisconsin, many other places are filled with people who want to save the world, want to stop global warming, want to fix income inequality, want to fix educational inequality, want to put a stop to police violence, want to get Americans vaccinated, Americans of all races and ethnicities vaccinated. And we often find ourselves in a position where we feel stalled. And we ask, why? Why is this not working? Why do we observe the vaccination rates we observe? Why do we observe persistent educational inequality? Why do we observe growing income inequality? What undermines our ability to stop global warming? And my answer to this question and my thinking on these questions writ large really goes back a number of decades. I was trained as an electrical engineer in the 80s in Canada. And in fact, I never had a job. In fact, before becoming a professor, I never even had a CV because I had been an entrepreneur for over a decade. In fact, you see an old-fashioned fax machine. I am the co-inventor of spam fax in the 80s, which is a business, well, it's a long story. I had many successes and many failures. And I often wondered what accounted for when things worked out the way I wanted them to and when they did not. What accounted for that? And the answer I've been trying to understand, and clearly there are many answers to these types of questions, but the answer I've been working on is an answer related to the nature of strategy in my own firms, and more recently thinking about how this applies to not only to firms, but organizations and social movements of all types. You know, it's often the case that it's the hardest questions to answer seem like they are the simplest. If you ask, what should a strategy, what are the characteristics of something that makes a useful strategy? I think the first answer has to be that a strategy defines what we should do. What should we do? If we had a strategy for solving global warming, the strategy has to tell us what we should do to address global warming. And I think most individuals in their own personal lives, I think most small businesses, most larger businesses, and moving beyond that, most of our public sector articulates what I call action-focused strategies. And what I mean by that is they articulate a strategy that is an action or a policy designed to achieve some overall aim. So there's some goal articulated and some set of actions. The goals are often self-evident. If it's a publicly traded company, we want to grow by X% a year. If it's a nonprofit working on global warming, we might want to reduce carbon emissions by Y% a year. And then there'll be some set of actions they're going to undertake. I want to argue that this approach to thinking about how we go about doing these things is fundamentally flawed and in part inhibits our ability to achieve the goals we articulate. And so I thought I'd give you an example. And it's one of my favorite examples. The Los Angeles Unified School District is typically the #2 school district in the country in size, behind only New York City. It was around 2011 or 2012. And you have to know the conditions of school districts in Los Angeles or in Philadelphia or in Detroit or in Chicago, big urban public school districts. These school districts are typically, and this doesn't mean all schools are bad in those districts, but these districts are typically a disaster. Graduation rates are much lower than we would desire. Even conditional on graduation, literacy levels are much lower than we would desire. I think this is an ambiguously a true statement. So it was 2011, 2012. The Los Angeles School District had been failing the students of LA for generations. Parents, children, grandchildren, generations failed by the system. And they had a big press conference and they announced, ladies and gentlemen, our strategy for fixing education in Los Angeles is iPads for all. iPads for all, ladies and gentlemen. You have to, so just to be clear how big a bet this was. For the school district of Los Angeles, this was a $1.5 to $2 billion bet. And you have to recognize how ridiculous this is. On the surface, it seems, what a great idea. And it would be a great idea if we thought that the problem underlying the failures of education in Los Angeles was a lack of information technology. And it might be. In fact, it might be a part of the problem, but there's a lot of prima facie evidence that it's not the core of the problem. The most obvious of which is that they had been failing the kids of LA for generations, going back to the 2000s, going back to the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, and the 60s. It's unlikely to be information technology. That is the core of the problem. I don't have the answer. The answer could be, and the answers, the problems framed in the media, but also in a variety of other sectors are home life, income inequality, poor teacher training, poor teacher salaries, strong teacher unions, the failures of public education. This would have been the former Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos's claim as she sought to privatize public education. Here's what we know. This strategy, this $2 billion strategy, was bad strategy because it was a strategy that didn't identify the core problem about that which needed to be addressed. I saw this a couple of years ago on NPR. Startups being founded to use blockchain to solve climate change. This is an example of a bad strategy. If you don't know what blockchain is, blockchain, forget about cryptocurrencies. Blockchain is just a highly secure distributed accounting system. And nothing wrong with having a good distributed, highly secure accounting system. Wow, we can better track carbon credits. But if you think accounting for carbon credit, better accounting for carbon credits is what will be the key thing to solve global warming, you're fooling yourself. It's not the core problem. So this approach to strategy, this action-focused approach, I think is fundamentally wrong. The argument I have been making for the last few years is when we answer this question, what should we do? I believe we have to start with answering the question, what problem should we solve? What problem should we solve? Right? Your job as the strategist in your personal life, in your social endeavors, in your work life, your job as the strategist is not first and foremost to pick the things you're going to do, the actions you're going to undertake. Your job is to identify the valuable problem, that problem that if solved, if addressed, will have a meaningful and large impact on your ability to achieve whatever that goal is you set out, whether it be reduced income inequality, reduced carbon emissions, improved school outcomes. You don't even recognize that some of the most successful organizations are those that do this. And you also don't recognize, and I've done a lot of consulting with big publicly traded multinationals who don't recognize this. They don't recognize that their job is to identify the most valuable problem. Go back, I guess 15 years now. Dropbox comes along and tells us, you've got a problem you didn't even know existed. And that was this file synchronization problem. They identified a valuable problem. Think about Moderna and BioNTech and COVID, right? For decades, they didn't come along and say mRNA. They said, look, for decades, we've suffered because of the challenges, the difficulties of designing and synthesizing vaccines, either the protein directly or viral vector type vaccines, which is relatively slow and laborious. And the folks behind Moderna and BioNTech said, aha, so the problem is the way we're going about doing it. Their solution is not to inject us with a protein, not to inject us with a viral vector, but to inject us with what is functionally a piece of RNA software, that has our own body build the protein. Think about Peloton. I'll leave you to think about what problem Peloton solved. I have sitting a few feet from me, a Peloton. What problem did they set out to address? You know, and we heard this from Dietram a little earlier, but I want to stress it. As you're thinking about this, your job is to ensure that you don't confuse the problem and the symptom. You see, because I don't think that most people, most public organizations, most firms, even large firms, make the distinction clearly. I've had CEOs tell me their problem is that sales aren't growing fast enough. You have to imagine how ridiculous that statement is. If I went to the doctor as a fat middle-aged man and I had chest pain, if the problem was the chest pain, the solution is very easy. Opioids for all. But the problem might be a heart attack or a pulmonary embolism, or it could be indigestion. You'd want your doctor to figure out what the problem is. You'd want your doctor to start there. Yet you don't demand this of yourself. You don't demand this of the firms you work for. You don't demand this of the social organizations you work for. Global warming isn't the problem. It's a symptom of some problem that is causing it. Income inequality isn't the problem. It's the symptom of some problem that is causing it. Gun violence is a symptom. It's not a problem. And the challenge of underwhelming educational attainment in urban settings is a symptom. It's not the problem. You see, the real work is not finding the solutions. You know, Einstein said this an awfully long time ago. The formulation of the problem is more essential than its solution. As a strategist in whatever you're doing, your job is to start by looking for the problem. The answers, the solutions are typically far easier. Thank you.